Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So, a Trump appointee by the name of Carl Higbie resigned after it came out that he made racist, sexist, anti-Muslim, and anti-gay statements on radio. This is a guy that the Trump administration appointed to be the chief of external affairs for the federal government's volunteer organization. And the name of that volunteer organization is the Corporation for National and Community Service. This man was supposed to direct the public imaging and messaging for the federal department that manages millions of volunteer services. This is a man who's made these racist statements, sexist statements, anti-Muslim statements, anti-gay statements. Now, I'm going to read some of his statements and then I'm going to provide my commentary. So he's made racist statements towards black people. He complained about black people being rude, and then he went on to say this about black people. He said, I believe this translates directly into the culture that is breeding this welfare and high percentage of people on welfare in the black race. It is a lack of morality. Then he went on to say this, we're promoting birth control to black women because of the incredible high rate of children born out of wedlock that are undercared for or not cared for at all. The taxpayers are tired of supporting government checks going to these people who think that breeding is a form of employment. Breeding is a form of employment. I'm sorry if black people are the majority of this targeted audience. They are, statistically, they are. So he's suggesting that black women are getting paid by breeding, that black people see that as a form of employment. He's saying that black people lack morality as a group and that black people have a welfare type of mentality. That's what this man thinks about black people. A man who's been appointed to a position to serve as the public voice for this government agency. And he also said this. He said that the African American thing, he was complaining about black people calling themselves African American. And he says this, the whole African American thing gets me whipped up because it's like 99%. And I'm paraphrasing here, people who write down African American have never been to Africa. Then he went on to say this, barring dual citizenship, you're either American or you're African, but you're not both. I don't care what you think. That's another thing that just sets me off. And then he went on to say this, in an urban area, and then he interjected, you mean ghetto area. When he was having a discussion about teaching in an urban area, he interjected to suggest that urban means ghetto. So those are some statements that he made about black people. And again, this guy was forced to resign because of these racist statements. And I'm going to go into detail. I want to respond to some of the things that he said, and then I'll move on to his statements about Muslims. This guy has the nerve to try to define who we are as a people. I mean, this is typical racist modus operandi. I mean, they think that they are entitled to define who we are and what we are. We define ourselves. We are Africans in America. We are African Americans. We come from the continent of Africa. Just like you have these other groups of people who come from different parts of the world. They have no problem identifying with where they come from. We are African people who came to this country. Our ancestors come from Africa. Our ancestors were kidnapped from Africa and brought to this land, enslaved in this land. So Africa is a part of our identity, and we don't have to be ashamed of that. We are both African and American. And that goes into a whole discussion about, the double consciousness and all that kind of stuff. I could do a whole video just on that alone. But, the fact that this man feels so entitled to tell us who we are. He feels so entitled to tell us how we should define ourselves. I mean, that speaks to this paternalistic, racist mentality that a lot of these people have. And then this perpetuation of the stereotype that black people are lazy and on welfare when the majority of black people are not even poor. The majority of black people work for a living. Whether they're working class or they're in the middle class or even in the upper middle classes, you have black people that work hard just like any other American. And what they try to do is put a black face on welfare. And I find that to be disgusting and despicable. When we work just as hard as any other group of people, even harder. We work twice as hard as these people for even less recognition and respect. I'm just tired of the stereotype that black people are just having children so that they can stay on welfare. Welfare is not profitable. People can barely survive on welfare. Nobody is breeding as a form of employment. These comments are despicable. And I'm just going to go into some of his other comments, and then I'm going to just provide my overall commentary about the fact that you would have somebody like this appointed to this key important position. It says a lot about Trump's administration. And I'll go into that in a minute. And then he goes on to say all these statements about Muslims. He says this, he says, I was called an Islamophobe, and I was like, no, 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 no. I'm not afraid of them. I don't like them. Big difference. Big difference. So he's basically saying, well, he's not afraid of Muslims. He just hates Muslims. And somehow that makes it okay. That makes it acceptable. I mean, if somebody were to say this about Jews or any other religious group like Christians or Catholics, there will be condemnation of that statement. But because in this society, an anti-Muslim attitude is embraced and accepted often, unfortunately. And then he goes on to say this. He says, go back to your Muslim shithole and crap in your hands and bang little boys on Thursday nights. I just don't like Muslim people. People always rip me a new one for that. Carl, you're racist. You can't. You're sexist. Then he goes on to say, I don't like Muslim people because their ideology sucks. So that's this man condemning a whole religious group. And then he says this about immigrants. He says, what's so wrong with wanting to put up a fence and saying, hey, everybody with a gun, if you want to go shoot people coming across the border illegally, you can do it for free. You can go do it on your own. And you'll be under the command, of the National Guard unit or Border Patrol. Then he says, you cross my border, I shoot you in the face. And he goes on and on. So this man is encouraging violence against undocumented immigrants, against illegal immigrants. That's nothing but hatred. This is the man that Donald Trump trusted to be the public voice of federal volunteer agencies. And then he goes on to make these anti-gay statements. But he also talks about Obama. Then he says this, speaking about this certificate issue, the birth certificate of Obama, this birtherism nonsense. He says, this birth certificate thing, sure, absolutely legitimate claim. I want to know if this guy, and then he says, where was this guy born? That's a legitimate question. Then he called Obama the Muslim who was born in Kenya. Don't get me started on that. And then he, says some other things about Obama being born in Kenya. And he basically said that people on public assistance shouldn't be able to vote. He said, if you've taken any benefit, if you have elected to take any benefit from the government at any given time during the election cycle, you do not get the right to vote at a subsequent election, because now you have people voting for a living. They don't have to work. And he goes on and on, basically saying that these people who are on public assistance shouldn't be able to vote. This is the man that Donald Trump thought was appropriate to appoint to this key position where he's the public voice for volunteer organizations. The fact that Donald Trump would select such a person tells you at minimum that the Trump administration fails to vet people that they appoint. They don't adequately vet, potential appointees. I mean, we've already seen the abysmal situation where the Trump administration tried to appoint somebody to be a federal judge, somebody with zero litigation experience, to be a judge over important matters. And here you have this situation where this person is supposed to be the public voice for the federal government. And I'm going to get to the section where it talks about exactly what he would do. He was supposed to direct the public image of the federal government and the messaging of the federal government. A man who's made racist statements, anti-Muslim statements, anti-immigrant statements, statements against poor people. This is the man that Donald Trump saw to be fit for that position. That tells you that Donald Trump's administration failed to vet this guy. And if they did vet him, that tells you a lot about the Trump administration as well. I mean, how are you going to appoint somebody who is on public record making these kind of statements? His voice is recorded making these statements. He was on radio programs making these statements. And this is a part of a pattern. Donald Trump surrounds himself with white supremacists. Whether we're talking about Steve Bannon, a man who bragged about creating Breitbart or being a part of Breitbart, making it one of the voices of the alt-right movement, a white supremacist movement. Whether you're talking about Donald Trump receiving so much support from white supremacists like Richard Spencer and David Duke, the KKK and the whole alt-right movement, and Donald Trump appointing the outright racists like Jeff Sessions. And, another person in the Department of Homeland Security, I can't recall his name, but another person identified with the alt-right movement. This man surrounds himself with these white supremacists and bigots. He is a white supremacist sympathizer. I've done videos before talking about how he referred to these white supremacists who rallied in Charlottesville, Virginia as good people, fine people. This is who this man is. He surrounds himself with these kinds of people. And you know what they say, you can tell a lot about people by the company they keep. Donald Trump is anti-Muslim. I've talked about the racist things that he has said. And this person, Carl Higbie, is a reflection of Donald Trump's own views. And it was only after this guy got exposed and called out and there was attention drawn to this that Donald Trump eventually pushed this guy out of, or had him resign. That's the only reason why. And, this whole thing, this situation, is just a reminder of how important intersectionality is. It's important for these different groups that are targeted by the same enemy need to unite against that common enemy. This same person that's anti-black is also anti-immigrant. The same person that's anti-black and anti-immigrant is also anti-Muslim and anti-gay. So it's like all these groups have it in their best interest to work together to fight against this common enemy in the Trump administration and the far right. So those are my thoughts. I'm glad that this guy was forced to resign. But those are my thoughts. Tell me what you think. Please rate, comment, and subscribe. Peace.